Hello, welcome to Shiloh. This is the ancient city of Shiloh, and one may ask, how do we know for sure that this is in fact the Shiloh of Tanakh? Well, throughout Tanakh we find that there are three basic detectors to be able to determine whether or not a place is in fact the way that it's identified. Albeit Eusebius has come here in the 3rd century trying to identify places based on their geographical locations. We know through the preservation of names, primarily through Arabs who have been here from the 7th century and on, but particularly here we have certain indicators. Not only the first directions that are given in Tanakh, but also artifacts that have been found here. And now the quest for today is going to be to try to figure out then, where is the Mishkan of Shiloh? The Mishkan that we see in Sefer Yehoshua, Perek Yudchet. Yehoshua had moved from Gilgal, from the eastern border, here to the central areas of Eretz Yisrael. And why does he choose Shiloh out of all places? Well, one can argue that at that particular time, this really is the center of the country. So what better place to bring all of Am Yisrael, Lamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, keeping in mind that Yerushalayim's selection has not yet been broadcast to Am Yisrael. In addition to the fact that Yehoshua himself is from Harei Ephraim. We are now in the southern hills of Nachalat Ephraim. What better way to be sensitive to the monarchy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu than through the human monarchy of Yehoshua ben Nun, through the human representative. And perhaps Yehoshua is also thinking back to the time of Sefer Breshit, wherein he knows that Avram Avinu had come from the northern parts of the country, wherein Hashem had told him by the areas of Shechem. And Avram continues from Shechem down to the areas of Beit El and Ai. This is where he receives promises of the land and of a nation. This is where Yaakov Avinu returns to and also receives his promise in the form of a dream. What better place then to show the materialization of the promises of our patriarchs, of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, than right between the areas of Shechem and Beit El. So in addition to Yehoshua bringing us to the central place in Eretz Yisrael, in addition to him thinking about the promises of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, maybe he's also thinking about the brachot of Yaakov Avinu to Yehuda. Lo yasur shevet miYehuda mechokek mi ben raglav ad ki yavo Shiloh v'lo yikat amim. Yehoshua knows that first the malchut, the governorship, has to go through Ephraim before it eventually is going to be secured by Shevet Yehuda. Well, here we are then in the southern hills of Ephraim. Here we are at the entrance of the city of Shiloh. And as mentioned, how do we know for sure this is Shiloh? Well, we know it's the entrance because of the Be'er, where there would be a source of water used not only for the city, but also for the outskirts of the city, for the farming. After all, we're in the areas of Ephraim, of Nachalat Yosef, blessed with the rains from above, Mimeged Tzvot Shemesh, Mimeged Geresh Yerachim. Blessed also from the Mayanot that we find all around this area, Nachal Shiloh, surrounding this tell, this artificial mound of various strata of Jewish history. But we also know that we're in Shiloh because as we continue from the time period of Yehoshua ben Nun through Sefer Shoftim, where we hear the notorious stories of Pesel Micha, distorted Avodat Hashem, the terrible story of Pilegesh Begeva, a story of Gilui Arayot, followed by the civil war of the tribes against Binyamin for the atrocity performed against this woman. We hear that after wiping out basically Shevet Binyamin, the other tribes regret and encourage Binyamin then, albeit not to be given wives, but rather take some of their daughters. The Navi of Sefer Shoftim, Shmuel Hanavi, has to provide them with directions how to get there. And what does he tell them? He says that when you come from Binyamin, come join us to our Chag, our great festival in Shiloh, Miyamim Yamima. This is how you get here. Asher mitzvona leBeit El. Continue north from Beit El, Mizracha Hashemesh, veer a little bit to the east, leMesila. Today's way of saying Yashar Yashar. Continue going straight until Ha'olam miBeit El Shechema, on the road that would take you from Beit El to Shechem. That's the road that we just got off of. Uminegev la Levona. But stop directly south of the village called Livona, a place where they used to manufacture the ketoret, obviously necessary for the Mishkan here in Shiloh. Today, Libuna Baya, directly north of Shiloh, even though preserved by Ma'ale Livona, a little south of us, the Yeshuva Yehudi of Ma'ale Livona, and then telling the people of Binyamin, now's your opportunity to join once again with an Am Yisrael here in the festivities of Shiloh. We know this exact location. We're now here at the entrance of the city with our natural source of water. Let's go in and let's search now for the place of Kedusha. Let us go and follow in the footsteps of Yirmiyahu and Shmuel Hanavi as we divulge the mysteries of the Kedusha of Shiloh. We've established that we're in the ancient site of Shiloh, and yet we're still searching for the Mishkan. So here we are, after we've entered, at least from the outskirts of the city, where we found our Be'er Mayim, right at the entrance of the city. So now, where are we? Let's look around. On one hand, this looks like a large area. Maybe we're in an ancient cistern. Some suggest, I don't know, maybe this was some type of congregational area. But wait a second, we look a little further and we see, no, we know where we are. This is still on the outskirts of the city because we're looking at a burial cave from the time period of Tkufat Bayit Sheni, the time period of the second Beit HaMikdash, known as the locular cave. And yet, what we do know is that we're still not really at the heart of the city, because we know, Chazal teach us, that how do we know that we're getting close to a city? A child would ask the father, "No, Abba, are we there yet?" And the father would say, "Oh, wait, I see the burial caves." Burial caves of which we find over 25 in this area of Shiloh, teaching us that this was a very popular city, not just during the time of Kibush Haaretz, and not only during the times leading, as we'll speak about, to Churban Bayit Rishon, but during the time period of Bayit Sheni. What better place to return to than one of the first cities where Am Yisrael conquered, settled, established a Mishkan. And we're still now in search of the Shekhinah. So let's continue. Maybe we'll actually find Makom HaMishkan. We're now in a Roman wine press, what is known as a gat in Tanakh. This is where Shevet Yosef, also blessed with the agriculture of the wine, not only Shevet Yehuda, or as we see, particularly in Shiloh, with kramim, with vineyards, on the outskirts of the area till today, bringing the story of the people of Binyamin coming to celebrate Achag LaHashem b'Shiloh. Go and take the women who are dancing in the kramim, dancing in the vineyards. And not only during the time then of Shoftim and during the time of the Mishkan and the first Beit HaMikdash, but during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, this became a major center for wine export to all the areas around. And here, once again, albeit we're not yet at the site of the Mishkan, what we recognize is that this was part of the commercial area of ancient Shiloh, once again an indicator that we're on the outskirts of the city. But not to worry, we're in the proper direction. We're going to head now to the city, still in search of where the Mishkan could be. Maybe it really is right in the center of town. Follow me. So we began on the southern side of Shiloh, walking through the city, and we saw the city walls, the ancient Canaanite walls, wondering where is the site of the Mishkan. We noted how there were people definitely living here during the time of Yehoshua ben Nun, different borot, different cisterns that date back to this time period. And now we find ourselves at the northern side of the city. And here we see a large open area. Maybe this is the site of the Mishkan? Well, really, only one way to tell. By virtue of the fact that we're going to learn in Yirmiyahu Perek Zayin that this place was destroyed. The Plishtim came, as described in Sefer Shmuel Aleph Perek Dalid, and destroyed the city of Shiloh, albeit it's not even mentioned explicitly there. So nothing remains, keeping in mind that the Mishkan was constructed with the bedrock on sides, but really made from atzei shitim, from a white acacia wood, covered and coated, as we know, with gold, and with a gag. Even if it became more permanent here in Shiloh, what determines whether or not it's a temporary or a permanent building is going to be whether or not it has a gag, a roof. So in Shiloh, there were still curtains like the Mishkan. nothing remains, albeit this large open area. In the 19th century, Wilson comes and he says, let's try to measure the area. For after all, we open up Sefer Shmot, Perek Chav Zayin, where we hear the dimensions of the Chatzer. V'asita et Chatzer HaMishkan lepat negev teimana kla'im lachatzer, sheish masar mea ba'ama orech lepeah ha'achat. It's in length 100 amot. V'amudav esrim v'adnehem esrim nechoshet v'avei hamudim b'chashukehem kasef v'chein lefa'at tzafon ba'orech kla'im mea orech v'amudav esrim v'adnehem esrim nechoshet v'avei hamudim b'chashukehem kasef. V'rochav hachatzer, and the width of the courtyard lepa'at yam kla'im 50 amah. The width is 50 amah. So all we have to do is really see, could this potentially be the site of the Mishkan, where we see that there is a large open area with stones, ancient stones on one side. And if we continue to walk down, we're going to prove that this is a tel, because eventually you would just fall off this cliff, because this is an elevated area. So sure enough, if you take a rope such as this and start to measure from one side the rochav of this area from one to the other with this basically 25-meter rope, which is approximately 50 amot, guess what? Yes, you will find, not surprisingly, that this is exactly 50 amot in width and exactly 100 amot in length. Oh my, here we are. We've discovered the site of the Mishkan. And just recently, as our archaeologists have returned here in order to see what else can be found, we've noticed that there were even buildings and storehouses here, as we're going to see as well. Welcome to the site of the Mishkan, but this is the beauty of coming and learning Tanakh on site. Not only does it bring the setting to life, but it helps us understand the story in Tanakh much more. It helps us appreciate the words of Chazal, who also bring Jewish history and the stories that we read about, helping us understand them, halacha l'ma'aseh, in the proper place of the Mishkan. As we said, not only by coming to site do we see how the stories of Tanakh come to life, but we also understand now when Chazal tell us in Masechet Megillah Daf Tet Amud Aleph, Ein ben Shiloh liYerushalayim. There's really no difference then with regard to the Kedusha of the Mikdash in Shiloh than there was to the formal, official, permanent that stood in Yerushalayim, except for a few differences. One, Ein ben Ella b'Shiloh. In Shiloh, look around. There isn't really that much room for Am Yisrael, especially if we take into account that the Kodesh Kodashim is properly facing the western area, so that as we enter, it doesn't look at all as if we're worshiping the sun. And then we have the area of the Kodesh, and the rest of this area is the Chatzer. But all of Am Yisrael, coming 3 times a year, aren't going to be able to fit in this Chatzer. Where are we going to be able to eat our karbanot, our shlamim? Well, the Gemara tells us, based on the Mishnah, v'chol haroeh. As long as you can see the place, the site of the Mishkan, then you can eat there. A little problem. If we look towards the city is surrounded by walls. If I'm in the city, I don't necessarily see the site of the Mishkan. But if I go a little farther north, if I go to, this has been excavated, thousands of animal bones of 1 to 3-year-old animals, kosher animals, even including, by the way, the gazelle, the tzvi. From Yehoshua in the 13th century until about the 10th century, they carbon dated these and found these thousands of bones. Looking over the site of the Mishkan, kol haroeh. As long as you can see, as opposed to, as we know, the time of the Beit HaMikdash, you would have to eat your katshekalim in the area of the Chatzer, or at least within the Chomot of Yerushalayim, but different halacha here in Shiloh. Here we are in the storehouses of the Mishkan, another proof that this is in fact the site of the original Mishkan of Yehoshua ben Nun. On the northern side of the city, we have discovered by the ancient Canaanite wall conquered by Yehoshua ben Nun, these ancient storehouses. And what was found in these ancient storehouses? Not only some of the reconstructed kelim, some of the vessels that we're familiar with us from this time period, but 7 pitchers, jugs, just like this. These are basically storage containers from the time period dated back to the time period, lo and behold, to 1300 BCE. to the time of the establishment of the Mishkan, that, as we discussed, lasted here and corroborated by the Gemara in Zvachim Kuf Yud Chet Amud Aleph. Here we see the Mishkan standing for 369 years. And what was found inside these jugs, you'll never believe it. The leftovers, literally on the bottom, the remnants of oil, of grapes, of wine, even of remnants of flour. These are the basic ingredients, as we know. Opening up Sefer Vayikra, the basic ingredients necessary to offer a karban mincha, all the flour offerings, in addition to the daily libations, the nisachim of yayin. This is what's necessary to store the shemen that's used not only for oil on the karbanot mincha, but also, as we know, for oil of the menorah and the ner tamid. We're standing here at the storage area meant for the Mishkan. This is where the Kohanim would go and they would take the necessary ingredients that they needed in order to properly worship Hashem on a daily basis. So as we open up the story of the battle of the Plishtim, the first attempt of the Plishtim to invade the mainland, going through the areas of Afek, today's Izbert Zater. This is the battle described in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Dalid. Vayhi dvar Shmuel l'chol Yisrael, vayetze Yisrael l'kra Plishtim lamilchama, vayachanu al ha'even ha'ezer, u'Plishtim chanu ba'afek, vayarchu Plishtim l'krat Yisrael, vatitosh ha'milchama, v'yinagef Yisrael l'fnei Plishtim. Yisrael is falling, vayakum maracha basadeh karbat alafim ish, a tremendous loss, 4,000 soldiers. Vayavo ha'amel ha'machane, vayamru zeknei Yisrael, lama nigafanu Hashem hayom lifnei Plishtim. How can Hashem do this to us? Have us fall before the Plishtim? You know what we're going to do? Nikcha eleinu mishilo, et aron brit Hashem vayavo b'kirbenu, v'yoshinu mekaf oivenu. The aron that was used as a symbol of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in their midst, and to take it with them to war, to leave the place of the Mishkan. This is already the beginning of the end. Here we see how the story brings to life Am Yisrael's religious perspective. They didn't merely see the Aron as symbolic of the presence of the Shekhinah, of godliness in their midst. Rather, they attributed strength to the Aron itself, vayavo b'kirbenu, as if the Aron has magical forces that are going to enable us to achieve salvation. Vayishlach ha'am Shiloh. So, albeit the battle is taking place farther up north this road, the nation comes back to Shiloh. Vayisu misham et Aron brit Hashem tzvaot. Even the terminology in this chapter associated with the Aron is going to connote a sense of might that this Ark of Covenant has. Brit Hashem Tzvaot, Yoshev HaKruvim. This is the ark that contains the Kruvim, the cherubic angels that represent the entourage of the Shekhinah. Besham Shnei Bnei Eli Imarom Brit Elokim, Chofni uPinchas. Parallel to the Kruvim, we hear about Chofni and Pinchas. They see themselves also as the guards of the Aron. These two sons of Eli that we've heard about already in the first and second chapters of Sefer Shmuel, who are distorting Avodat Hashem. Here we see as well, they're going to take the Aron from Shiloh, from the Mishkan. Vayhi kavo Aron brit Hashem al ha'machaneh, vayaru kol Yisrael trua gdola vatehom haaretz. Everyone is astounded. And when the Plishtim hear the kol hatrua, and they see vayidu ki Aron Hashem ba el ha'machaneh, they're afraid. And the irony is that the Navi presents the perception of the Plishtim in a very similar manner as that of Am Yisrael. The Plishtim also say, oh no, Amru ba Elokim al ha'machaneh, vayamru oy lanu ki lo hayta kazot etmol shelshom, oy lanu mi yatzilenu miyad ha'elokim hadirim ha'ele. They see the ark itself, the physical ark, as a power, as an Elokim. Elohim ha'elokim ha'makim et Mitzrayim b'chol makah b'midbar. They're attributing the power of the makot of Yetziat Mitzrayim to the physical symbol of the Aron. And this is truly reflective of how Am Yisrael are looking at this as well. Hitchasku, nonetheless, the Plishtim say, we are going to garner strength and we are going to fight against these people by Yelachamu Plishtim. And sure enough, the Navi tells us that Yisrael especially with such a perception of the presence of God in their midst, worshiping the Aron not as a means but as an end in and of itself, reminiscent surely of Chet HaEgel, helps us appreciate how this is going to be the major shortcoming that is going to not protect Am Yisrael, but on the contrary, Vayinakfu Yisrael. Yisrael is going to fall in this war. Vayanusu ish la'ohala vatiha makah gdola ma'od vayipol miYisrael 30,000 ragli. But that's not the worst of the tragedies. Va'aron Elokim nilkach u'shnei b'nei Eli metu Chofni u'Pinchas. The Plishtim from the battlefield take the Aron with them, and they kill the priests Chofni and Pinchas, the children of Eli. But now comes the aftermath. Vayaratz ish Binyamin mehamaracha vayavo Shiloh bayom hahu. And then a refugee of the war from Binyamin comes to Shiloh. Vayavo, he comes with his torn clothing, madav kruim, vadama arosho, vayavo vine Eli yoshev al hakisei. It's described as if the man comes to the city while Eli is sitting on his chair, yad derech mitzapeh, looking out towards the battlefield, ki haya libo chared al aron ha'elokim, because he's afraid not so much for his children, not even necessarily for the outcome, but Eli himself also gave a tremendous amount of credence to this Aron, to the standards of worship. And the Aron, representing the presence of God, is no longer here in Shiloh. And he's afraid what has happened to the Aron. Va'ish ba lahagid ba'ir. And the man comes and he proclaims and he tells the people in the city the disaster, the downfall, the complete defeat of Am Yisrael. Vatiz'ah kol ha'ir. And the entire city starts to scream. And you can imagine, the Plishtim then are on their way here. Everyone's packing up their belongings, trying to run away from the Plishtim, trying to save the family members. Vayishma Eli et kol hatza'aka. And Eli hears the screaming, Vayomer mekol hahamon hazeh. And it's true that Eli is blind at this point, but still, how does he not know if he's at the northern part of the city? How does he not know what the news was? Vayish meher vayavo vayagid le'Eli. Well, once we're here in the city of Shiloh, it all becomes very clear. This isn't the entrance of the city. This is the Tel. This is the site of the Mishkan, literally on the road, making it very central for anyone coming from the north, the south, the east, the west of Eretz Yisrael, shalosh pamim b'shana, 3 times a year, right off the road, to be able to come and celebrate together. But the entrance to the city was on the southern side. So when the refugee comes, he doesn't enter through the area of the Mishkan. The entrance to the city where you would prepare, where you would immerse yourself in a mikvah, in a ritual bath, where you would get your karbanot ready. That's the city that we just went through. You would come in from the southern entrance, right by that Be'er Mayim that we saw. And that's when the refugee from Binyamin tells the people in the city, Eli is sitting over here. The people are over there, higher up in the city. And he hears their screams and their cries, and he knows that there's some crisis. But he's right here at the entrance of the Mishkan. He's here together with Shmuel, who isn't mentioned in the scene of destruction. And only when the man comes through the city, he now stands before Eli. Ve'Eli ben 98 shana, ve'inav kama v'lo yachol lirot. Vayomer ha'ish el Eli, anochi haba min hamaracha, va'ani min hamaracha nasti hayom. Vayomer ma haya hadavar b'ni. Vayan hamebaser vayomer nas Yisrael lifnei plishtim. He begins with what he knows is the least worst of the news. Well, we all had to run away from the Plishtim. V'gam magefa gdola hayta ba'am. And there was a terrible, terrible makah, a terrible magefa, a plague amongst the people. V'gam shnei banecha metu, Chofni u'Pinchas. And your own 2 sons have died. But he knows he saves the worst for last. Va'aron ha'elokim nilkacha. Vahi kaskiro et aron ha'elokim. ויפול מעל הכיסא האחורנית בעד יד השער, ותשבר מפרקתו וימות, כי זקן האיש, וכבד, והוא שפט את ישראל 40 שנה. Eli, upon hearing the news, falls backwards, and as he falls on the nape of his neck, he dies, only as we hear to have finished an era of 40 years, reminiscent of the positive Shoftim that we hear at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, of Othniel and Ehud, Shamgar, and Deborah and Gedona. Eli is counted amongst them, and yet the era is gone. And the story isn't over yet. The Navi decides to remind us of a story that happened with Eli that is reminiscent of another story. V'chalato eshe Pinchas hara lalat v'tishmat hashmua el hilakach Aron Elokim v'umet chamia v'isha v'techra v'teled ki nafchu aleha tziraha. Here in the areas of Ephraim, his daughter-in-law, the wife of Pinchas, starts going into labor, uke'et muta, and as she dies, she turns to all those around her turn to her and say, Al tiri, ki ven yaladet v'lo anta v'lo shata liba. You have a son, and she names the son Ikavod. May he not have any respect, because respect has been stripped from Am Yisrael for having the Aron taken from us. Vatomer gala kavod mi Yisrael, ki nilkach Aron ha'elokim. Here we are in Shevet Ephraim, the son of Yosef, the son of Rachel Imenu. Shmuel Hanavi wants to remind us that this isn't just a tragic story. This is a story of Avodah Zarah. This is a story of distorted Avodat Hashem. And just as Rachel understands that she's dying because she took the Trafim, and she dies just a little south of here, between the areas of Binyamin and Ephraim, between the Nachalot of Binyamin and Yosef. Here we are in the heart of Nachalot Rachel, recognizing that the tears and the cries and the sins of the past are still haunting and taunting Am Yisrael. Shiloh is the Menucha. Shiloh is the resting place, the temporary stopover on our way to the Nachala. El HaMenucha ve'el HaNachala. We're going to get to that Nachala. We're going to get to Yerushalayim. And we're going to learn momentarily how our perception of Yerushalayim is different than Shiloh. But one can't properly understand what Yerushalayim represents without first coming back to where it began, at the first site of the Mikdash, here in the temporary Mishkan, the tabernacle of Shiloh. Now we can understand the famous Nevuah of Yirmiyahu. Even during the time of Yoshiyahu of religious reform, he's still living during a time wherein Am Yisrael are influenced by the terrible adulteration of Avodat Hashem, the idolatry that Menashe ben Chizkiah introduced under the Assyrians, with one of the harshest Nevuot of Perek Zayin in Sefer Yirmiyahu. Ko amar Hashem tzvot Elokei Yisrael heitivu darchechem u'malalechem v'ashakna etchem b'makom hazeh. There are two ways to stay here, says Hashem. Firstly, improve your ways. But secondly, al tiftachu lachem, al divrei hasheker lemor, heichal Hashem, heichal Hashem, heichal Hashem hema. Stop listening to your false leaders, to your false prophets, who are saying, look at this. This is the temple of God. This is the house of God. There's something very not only symbolic here, but this is God's house, and therefore God will never destroy this temple. And therefore Yirmiyahu has to convince them and explain, you've lost sight of what Avodat Hashem is. He continues and he says, what must you do in order to improve your ways? Not bring more karbanot, not more sacrifices, but rather asot tasu mishpat beinishu bein reyehu. You have to engage in proper justice. Ger yatom v'mana lo tashoku v'dam naki al tishpuchu b'makom hazeh. Stop murdering. Stop committing all different types of iniquities. Ben adam lachavero v'acharei Elohim acherim lo telechu lara lachem. First, he emphasizes and concentrates on the justice and the interaction between man and his fellow man, taking care of the indigent in society, stopping to murder, which we know also doesn't just defile the temple, but defiles the land, which is why the Navi continues, Vishikanti etchem b'makom hazeh ba'aretz asher natati lavotechem. Don't think that the transcendence of God can truly be limited to a place in Yerushalayim, to one temple, perhaps in Shiloh. Don't think that there's actual intrinsic value. After all, Shlomo Melech in his famous tefillah upon the inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash exclaims, Hallo Hashamayim u'shmei Hashamayim lo yichalkalucha. Hashem, this building cannot contain you. Even the heavens up above can't contain you. Rather, what's the function of this Beit HaMikdash? To remind us that there's a place that we're going to be more conscious of you, more conscious of the mitzvot, more conscious of our values. A place then that we're going to see really as a stairway to heaven, a place wherein we're going to come together and daven properly to you, incorporating, as Shmuel Hanavi says, as he learned from his mother, the value of tefillah. And therefore, Yirmiyahu continues, Hinei atem botchim lachem al devrei hasheker, levilti ho'il, haganov ratoach v'na'ofi, shaval hasheker bekater labal v'aloch acharei Elohim achirim, asher lo yadatem. Does it make sense that you're going to not only leave God, but also engage in improper interactions with lies? And notice how he mentions in a backwards and chiastic form all the Aseret HaDivrot. You have basically transgressed the basic covenant, the brit with Hashem. Uvatem v'madatem lefanai b'bayit hazeh. And now you stand here in Yerushalayim, in this home, asher nikra shemi alav. You don't understand. This isn't Heichal Hashem. It's not the house of God. Rather, it's Habayit Asher Nikra Shemi Alav. It's the house associated with my name. It's the house that you're supposed to understand what the values of Hashem are all about. It's not my home. I can't be contained in a physical structure. It's the home that you associate with my name, my reputation. Va'amartem, but you don't understand that. You're saying Nitzalnu. This is a haven, as pagans believed. Leman asot et kol hatoivot ha'ileh. Hamarat paritzim haya bayit hazeh, asher nekrash mi alav beinechem, gam anochi hinei ra'iti nom Hashem. You think that this is a hideaway for all the thieves? Ki lechuna el mikomi asher b'Shiloh. He says, you've done this before. Go now to Shiloh. Come back here. Take your Tanakh in hand and see how the story comes to life. Understand Yirmiyahu's message, which one cannot fully appreciate unless one comes here to Shiloh, unless one opens up Sefer Shmuel and realizes that Shmuel talks about the taking of the Aron and never once mentions the actual destruction of the Mishkan, that at that point had already been built with stone as a quasi-permanent structure. Shmuel Hanavi never mentions it because he's trying to bring Am Yisrael away from a concentrated service of Hashem. Yirmiyahu Hanavi recognizes that the people are failing in a very similar manner. The people are also distorting their understanding of what a Heichal Hashem is versus, as we see throughout Sefer Dvarim, Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, Hamakom Asher Shmi Hashem Alav. Hashem says, you're supposed to be thinking of me. You're supposed to be thinking of my covenant. And therefore, when you forget about this, go to Shiloh. Because in Shiloh, as we've learned, they also forgot about this. They were worshiping the Aron no longer as a means, but as an end. So go to Shiloh, Asher Shikanti Shmi Sham Barishona. That was the first place that I wanted you to recognize what it means to recognize the immanence of God in this world. Ra'u et asher asiti lo mipnei ra'at ami Yisrael. And see what I did. Va'ata yanas otchem et kol ha'ma'asim ha'ile num Hashem. Va'daber alechem hashkem v'daber v'lo shamatem. Ve'ekra etchem v'lo anitem. And I've tried to teach you these messages, says Hashem. So in the meantime, go on a tiyul to Shiloh. Va'asiti labayit asher nikrash mi alav, asher atem botchim bo v'lamakom asher natati lachem la'avotechem, kasher asiti l'Shiloh. Take a look around at the destruction. Take a look and see that all we have really is the bedrock upon which the Mishkan of Shem Hashem once stood. Ve'eshlachti etchem mi'al panai kasher hishlachti et kol achichem et kol zera Ephraim. And sure enough, if we turn and we see that Yirmiyahu repeats some of these ideas of him not even being allowed to daven anymore on their behalf, here in Perek Zayin, in Perek Aleph, again in Perek Chafav, he turns to the people, and apparently a continuation of the exact same nevuah at the beginnings of the time period already. Bereshit Mamlechet Yehoyakim, the son of Yoshiyahu, Yoyakim, who allies himself with Mitzrayim in defense against the Babylonians, confident that this is a temporary political setback. He's told by Hashem, stand b'chatzar Beit Hashem, stand in Yerushalayim, but tell the people again that they should not be confident in Heichal Hashem. Instead, the same idea. You can go on a sior to Shiloh and see that just as I destroyed Shiloh, v'natati et habayit hazeh k'Shiloh, the Beit HaMikdash will be destroyed like Shiloh, v'et ha'ir hazot etein l'chlala l'chol goyei ha'aretz. And similarly, in Mizmor Tehillim, the Mizmor of Ayin Chet 78, written by the Mishorer before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, he notes how, because of the sins, Ben Adam Lamakom and Ben Adam Lachavero, the people of Ephraim, the people of the northern tribes of Yosef, witness the destruction of Shiloh. Similarly, the very next Mizmor, Mizmor Ayin Tet, tells us after the Churban of the north, what do you know? The people of Yehuda suffered a very similar Churban. The only way to really understand what the Mikdash of Yerushalayim represents is to come back here to Shiloh and see the difference between a Mikdash that people see as a Heichal Hashem, as God's holy temple, versus a Mishkan, Asher Shachan Shmi Alav, a place of residence of Hashem, that we're supposed to appreciate may exist in greater dimensions and grandeur in Yerushalayim. But if we distort the messages of God's covenant, if we distort the messages of social justice, of living up to the values of Sefer HaBrit, of Parshat Mishpatim, of Divrei HaTorah, then unfortunately, as Yirmiyahu witnessed himself, the Heichal Hashem in Yerushalayim, the Beit HaMikdash, can end up just like Shiloh. We're not going to end our Shiur here in Shiloh on a negative note, the note of destruction, the note of distorted Avodat Hashem, Yirmiyahu's famous Nevuah of come to Shiloh and see how just as Shiloh was destroyed, Yerushalayim will be destroyed. Well, Baruch Hashem, not only 70 years after the Churban Beit HaMikdash was the second Beit HaMikdash built, and now 2,000 years after that Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, we have a Mikdash Ma'at once again here in Shiloh. In 1978, after the Six-Day War, the miracles of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the members of Gush Emunim, they came back here to Shiloh to establish a Makom Mikdash. After 369 years of this being the capital, this is once again a beautiful Yishuv with a Makom Mikdash at its center, a Mikdash Ma'at, as we enter and see how it was built in order to remind us of the Mishkan. But not just the Mishkan, but the messages that Yirmiyahu says we must learn from the destruction of the Mikdash. Haba el makom zeh, el habayit, habeit tfilah, v'yirat makom mekudash. Someone who comes here with the fear, recognizing, someone who comes here, v'yirat makom mekudash, someone who recognizes that it's not the Heichal, it's not the building itself, but it's the values. It's our concentration on what Hashem's values mean here. The Makom Asher Shmi Alav, someone who understands what a place of Kedusha is all about, Yitzapeh v'yiskeh le'bniyat HaMikdash. That's the message that we take with us from Shiloh, certainly during the days of Tishat HaYamim, to understand the messages of the destruction of Shiloh, the destruction of Yerushalayim, how Shiloh is rebuilt, and Be'ezrat Hashem, if we understand the words of the Nevi'im, of Shmuel Hanavi, of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, then we have what to look forward to in the rebuilding of the Mikdash.